Thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate it enormously. I'd like to thank the Alliance Française's president, David Horn, Mary Ellen Conlon, who introduced me with such graciousness a moment ago, the executive director of the Alliance, Amy Laberge, director of programs, Connery Hoffman, director of educational outreach, who kindly asked me to come back, the board of directors, the staff, and all the supporters of the Alliance Française. To all of you, I am very grateful for the opportunity, for the first time in 18 months working from home, being asked to go somewhere and dress like an adult again. Lectures are long in production. They're not necessarily the easiest thing to explain how they're put together, but I do feel I would be remiss in not giving thanks to some of the scholars and writers who have come before me and whose work inspired me enormously. My friend Laurence Benaim, who wrote a wonderful biography of Marie-Laure de Noailles called La Vicomtesse du Bizarre. That is where I took the title for this lecture today, because although the Vicomtesse was herself bizarre, she did have a husband who helped in that, at least for a while. Also Dorothée Humbert, who is a landscape architect and scholar who works now in a professorial position at Ohio State University. She wrote an extraordinary book in 1993 called The Modernist Garden in France. And of course, I could not do without the diaries of the composer Ned Rorem and the memoirs of the art experts James Lord and the late Sir John Richardson, all three men who knew the Noailles very well, for good and for ill. So who were Marie-Laure and Charles de Noailles? Here is a photograph of them taken maybe 6 or 8 years after their marriage in 1923. They were the most consequential of French patrons of the arts. They used both of their individual and combined fortunes to promote, create, encourage the most advanced and often scandalous examples of painting, sculpture, music, film, dance, and architecture. Without them, it would be fair to say that the careers of Salvador Dali, Balthus, Jean Cocteau, Man Ray, Louis Buñuel, Eric Satie, and many other earth-shaking talents of the Surrealist period would have taken much longer to have gotten off the ground. If you wanted to make a movie so perverse that it would upset the Catholic Church and result in your being expelled from the Jockey Club, you turn to the Noailles. If you wanted to have yourself painted in ways that you appeared to be melting down the canvas and then showed it off at a party only to scandalize all of Paris, you would turn to the Noailles. Almost anything that they did that was considered off the edge artistically, they were always the ones behind it. No less important is their patronage of cutting-edge landscape design, although that aspect of their patronage is less known because, as we all know, gardens are ephemeral. They grow, they die, plants have to be replaced, soil has to be redone, tastes change, gardens disappear. And even if they do survive in an iconic fashion, they're really nothing more than a carefully tended simulacrum, giving us an idea of what they had been at their height, if not the actual reality. Marie-Laure de Noailles is undoubtedly the most famous of the two, largely because she was the most temperamental, whereas Charles de Noailles spent his life more quietly as an individual. His wife taunted the world, challenged it, forced it to do her bidding, even terrified it. In the words of Ned Rorem, the American composer, who lived with her in Paris for several years, and was supported by her largesse, Marie-Laure is, first of all, a child. Second, an artist. Third, a vicomtesse. Fourth, she's a saint. Fifth, a masochist. Sixth, a malicious bitch. Above all, she is generous and not to mention crazy. In short, she has all it takes to make blood flow fast and far from boredom. She, like Cocteau, knows about the beauty of beginnings and the death of inertia. She was also exceptional when it came to subject matter, as we see here in this incredibly beautiful solarized photograph on the left of her by Man Ray in her early 30s, Salvador Dali's magnificent double portrait of her, and then her famous portrait by Balthus. The two paintings hung in her salon at her house on the Place des États-Unis for most of her life until age began to show and all representations of her were banished to other rooms. Alberto Giacometti sculpted her multiple times in plaster, bronze, gold, and terracotta. But she wasn't merely a patron. She was also a creator. Marie-Laure painted and painted well, her works being shown in galleries as well as at the annual Salon de Noailles. She wrote novels as well as poems under her own name, as well as the pseudonym Erica Ferrara. And she also lent her hand to stage productions, devising sets for ballets and other public divertissement, such as Le Combat. You see here the ballet composed by Raffaello de Banfield and choreographed by Roland Petit. Marie-Laure designed the costumes as well as the sets. As for personal style, Baron Alexis de Rede said she would place a postcard next to a Goya or a teddy bear beside some Augsburg silver. He went on to say she was unconventional, sometimes badly behaved, not always kind, and always a great trial to her friends. So let's start at the moment, in the beginning. Oh, did I do something? Yes, I did. That's all right. Okay. Thank you. There we go again. That's again my fault. I'm not mechanically inclined, as you can all tell. Charles Arthur Anne-Marie de Noailles, shown here on the left, was born in 1891. His father, the Prince de Poix, was the eldest son of the Duc de Mouchy, who died of pneumonia in his early 30s. It was a family that was among the most glorious in France, a noble clan that can trace its history back to the 9th century, with all the requisite chateau, gardens, and political positions that sweep of history implies. In the center is his father, the Prince de Poix. His maternal grandmother was Mary Ray, an American real estate heiress from New York, shown here in an 1883 portrait by Gustave Jacquet, not too many years after she married the Vicomte du Bois de Courval. Most importantly, or most excitingly, he was also a direct descendant of Napoleon's sister, Caroline, and her husband, the legendary Marshal Murat, who became king and queen of Naples. And while not the heir to the Mouchy dukedom, Charles de Noailles fully expected to come into estates of his own, thanks to his half-American mother, the widowed Princesse de Poix. Although her family house, the moated Chateau de Pinon, had been destroyed by German forces during World War I, the widowed Madeleine swiftly purchased another famous property, the Hermitage at Fontainebleau, the exquisite neoclassical morsel that was built in 1749 for Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV. So here we have the hero of our tale, rich, cultivated, elegant, an example of what one admirer, the famous transvestite acrobat Barbette, called en toute simplicité, the only real gentleman left on earth. Marie-Laure, Honorite, and Bischofsheim, his eventual wife and partner in daring aesthetics, however, came from more Proustian stock. Shown here is a photograph of her taken when she was about 5 years old. She was born, coincidentally enough, on Halloween Day, 1902, and into a vigorous family known for its wealth, its power, and its uneasy position in French society. The Bischofsheims were Jewish, originally from Germany, and set themselves up in Belgium, where they became founders of one of the greatest banks of the 19th century, which eventually became part of what is today Banque Paribas. At left is the founder of the clan, Louis Raphael Bischofsheim. It was through him that Marie-Laure counted herself as part of a network of banking fortunes relating her by birth or by marriage to the Goldsmiths, the Bambergers, the Erlangers, the Condamvert, and the Hirsch families, families with financial footholds in Paris, London, Brussels, Amsterdam, Antwerp, Frankfurt, anywhere across the world. Here, as I said, is Monsieur Bischofsheim, and on the right, I just had to include her because it connects us again back to Proust, was his mistress, Laure Heyman, a courtesan par excellence, whose life inspired Proust in the creation of his character Odette de Crécy in À la recherche du temps perdu. The ancestor that Marie-Laure was most proud of, however, was the so-called divine Marquis, the Marquis de Sade, her great-great-great-grandfather. The original manuscript of his perverse book, 120 Days of Sodom, a scroll nearly 40 feet in length that was written when the Marquis was imprisoned in the Bastille in the 1780s, was an especially prized possession, which came back into Marie-Laure's hands after having left the family in 1929. And perversely, as was her case, she had a special container made for it shaped like a phallus. A moment ago, I mentioned again that Proust mined the life of Raphael Bischofsheim mistress for fictional purposes. He did the same with Marie-Laure's extremely sharp-tongued grandmother, Laure de Chavigny, seen on the left, one of Paris's great hostesses and saloniers, and reportedly the first woman of her class to say the word merde in public. Madame de Chavigny was one of the inspirations for the Duchesse de Guermantes, and her life is followed in great and fascinating detail in the recent book, Proust's Duchess. Neither of these families was known for their gardens, however, at least not until around World War I. Marie-Laure's father, as I'd said, had died when she was 1.5 years old of tuberculosis, and her memory of that marriage she only heard through friends, and it was an arranged marriage pushed very hard by Laure's mother, who, Laure de Chavigny, who was not over fond of the religion of the Bischofsheims, but she was wildly appreciative of their fortune. Marie-Laure once said, "My father loved my mother, she did not care for him." In 1910, however, Marie-Laure's mother, Marie-Thérèse, became the wife of Francis de Coisset, a successful young playwright. She wrote about how this was the first time that she'd ever done anything on her own without consulting her mother. She just went ahead and did it. Again, Laure de Chavigny was not pleased by Françoise de Croisset's religion. He was also Jewish, but she was very happy that he was famous. And he was one of the most popular and successful playwrights of his day. Together, they would go on to build a romantic estate near Grasse, the Villa Croisset, the house and its influential Mediterranean-style gardens composed by a family friend, Ferdinand Bach, and of which today almost nothing remains. As a teenager, Marie-Laure fell in love with Jean Cocteau, seen here with her mother at Villa Croisset. The nuptials never came to pass for a myriad reasons. Madame de Croisset did not find a poor aspiring writer a very good match, and that his emotional interests were directed at men rather than women proved to be a bit of an obstacle as well. Another engagement was announced, this time between Marie-Laure and Prince Achille Murat, but that was swiftly broken. And to everyone's surprise, 6 months later, she was married to Charles de Noailles. And the couple, who became known as Les Charles, moved into Hotel Bishop's, oh, here's her, sorry, I meant to show the wedding picture. I rather love this image of them coming out of the cathedral at Grasse. And then this beautiful portrait of Marie-Laure. Shortly after their marriage, the Croissets, who had been living in the Bischofsheim mansion in Paris, moved out, and Marie-Laure and Charles moved in. This is the house at 11 Place des États-Unis. Magnificent square, I'm sure many of you know, and around it was built some of the most important houses for some of the most important families in the late 19th century, including Ferdinand Bischofsheim and his American wife. President Woodrow Wilson borrowed the house in 1919 during the peace talks. His wife, Edith, wrote how much she admired the garden outside of the bedroom windows. But unfortunately, the descriptions of that garden are few, other than the mention of some grass and a couple of fountains. Marie-Laure and Charles decided to do the house over, or at least a good portion of it. Here you see on the left, the drawing room as it was at the time of her grandparents and her parents, and on the right, how it was transformed by the Noailles, who had commissioned Jean-Michel Franck to give them a completely modern room. Enter, so here's the triangular garden on the south side, southwest side of the house, as it is largely today, bordered on one side by what was then the Rue Nito, and on the other by the Place des États-Unis. So some grass and a couple of fountains doesn't sound terribly exciting. And of course, the Noailles, being the modern patrons of arts that they already were at this very early stage in their marriage, they decided to change it. Enter Paul Vera, a painter and a decorator, and his brother André, a landscape designer. The brothers had published a treatise in 1912 called Les Nouveaux Jardins. And it was about how French traditional gardening needed a radical rethink. It couldn't just be constant repetitions of elegant, elaborate, but in the end, unmoving parterres. So they thought they would go back to that history and then bring it into the modern world, whether it, I presume, kicking and screaming into the modern world. So they wanted to make this, this amazing modernist reinvention of the style régulier. So they wanted to prove that gardens could embrace cultural evolution and progress. The idea, so here are several of their proposals, not for the Noailles, but for a variety of gardens, including an octagonal parterre with these towering trees, very modern angular plantings. And I love the hemispherical garden that sort of falls down into a fountain effect. The idea for the Noailles that was accepted was a fractured landscape, a fragmented parterre with angles so sharp and patterns so kinetic that it resembled a shattered stained glass window. Like Le Nôtre's great parterres at Château de Versailles, the Noailles' new garden was meant to be admired from on high. In this case, through the windows of the mansion's salle de fête, an extravagant space that Marie-Laure's grandfather had plucked from a Sicilian palace. So imagine you're in this incredibly Baroque, overwhelmingly gilt space that is very much a moment of the 18th century and folderol, and then you look out the windows and suddenly you are transported in a flash into the present day. The idea of it all was colored gravel outlined with box hedges, with these also interweaving of box hedges and flowers that were, or plants that grew very low and that would be torn out as the seasons progressed or as fancy desired. So it was like a kaleidoscope all year round. Along the Rue Nitto was a mirrored wall that reflected the garden and had a small door at one end where you can see slightly angled was where the door came in from the Rue Nitto, which was inspired by, I believe, the not only the mirrored screens of the time that were popular in decoration, but also this Vera project for a dramatically, theatrically shaped hedge with cutout niches for sculptures and such. And that was one of the things that the Noailles did place in various spots in that long mirrored wall. Now, as I said, the idea of the garden was to look at it, not to be in it. But as we know, gardens do not exist in a vacuum, and neither do people who commission them. Of course, you want to go out and be in them. There's very few explorations of how the Noailles used the garden on a daily basis. But what can be discerned is that along that south facade of the house ran a long terrace that was accessed by windows. There are a few photographs from various time periods, usually of people close up in candid photographs of furniture. You can also see that the garden, that the paths are quite wide, so it can be strolled in, it can be enjoyed in other ways. Tables can be pulled out. There's a lovely Moreau settee at the far corner. And here you can see the Noailles with a group of friends who are visiting. And also the image at the upper right is one of a wonderful sculpture by Jacques Lipchitz, one of his standing figures. And that again is one of the statues that would be tucked into this mirrored screen. So here we go back and we see what it was, what it is now, excuse me. One of the most interesting features I find of the garden is at the far end, you see an opening that was added by the Noailles, and it was the summer dining room. So that we know then that it was used for dining, it was used for tableau vivant, it was used for orchestral productions, it was used for dance productions, a stage for life as well as a stage for the public, or at least for their guests. Here you see a bit more of the summer dining room. Here is it set as it was decorated by Jean-Michel Franck, showing again how it was used during the evenings or during the day in the summer. Here are the Noailles with their decorator, Jean-Michel Franck, at the dinner table, set for the evening. And as I had mentioned, tableau vivant, or just sort of creative stagings for fun. That was a lot of what was done in the 20s and 30s. That fascinates me with what we did before television and Instagram, was a lot of personal creativity, or at least if you had a lot of money, you could get away with it. Here's one of them where Marie-Laure, her husband, and Jean-Michel Franck are pretending to be ghosts and having Man Ray photograph the whole event for posterity. Balls were also a huge production among the rich in Paris from certainly the 18th century up through arguably the 1970s. But the 1930s was an especially rich period of time. And the Noailles were leaders in this. Here you have two images of the summer dining room being used again for photography, and the guests in their costumes being photographed for a personal album. One of my favorite moments is when Marie-Laure asked guests to come, and I can't quite remember what the actual theme was, but you see here on the right, Jean-Michel Franck dressed as Marie-Laure de Noailles and his hostess on his against him. Their balls and events were extraordinary. And again, this idea also of keeping them recorded for history. So here we see one of the guests being transformed into a woman with marcelled hair in the house with other guests looking on. Here we have the Noailles at, I believe it's their 19th century ball, the 1900 ball on the left, and Marie-Laure at the Racine ball with her lover at the time, the ballet star Serge Liffard. Marie-Laure on the right here in a group with a group of women who were attending a costume ball given by the Duchesse de Dudoville, and Marie-Laure on the right dressed as Louis XV, who she felt she resembled more and more as time went by. And as her friends pointed out, that her profile was absolutely the king. But her bowls they were wonderful. She did a bowl called Le Fond de la Mer, where everyone was to come as something that swam or lived on the bottom of the sea. She did the Fête des Rois, where everyone came wearing crowns of all different kinds. This is an image of the 1956 writers and painters ball of the 15th and 16th centuries, where everyone was to come, obviously, as a writer or a painter of those two particular epochs. But also what was prized was how obscure you could pull this off, so that it wasn't enough for you to come as this subject of a painting. You had to come as the subject of the painting's mistress's third cousin twice removed. So that the idea was, it wasn't just having your fellow guests guess who you were, it was supposed to be a puzzle. And one of my favorite moments is where Ned Rorem delivers a wonderful passage in his diaries about Marie-Laure and the couturier Jacques Fat at luncheon, talking about, which seemed to be a big thing to talk about, but for many people, what the subject of the next ball was going to be. And Jacques Fat suggested perhaps she should have a ball where the importance was that everyone was disguised so thoroughly that nobody would know who anybody was. Even by the end of the evening, you were not supposed to know. Whereupon this sent Marie-Laure off on a tangent of fantasy, suggesting that Fat work on designing costumes. This ball did not happen, by the way. The costumes where only a finger would show, or a nipple, or there would be a slice in the mask so you could stick the tongue out. Very surreal. She also gave a ball in 1958, unfortunately, right at the time of the crisis in Algeria. Marietta Tree writes in her diaries about what bad taste it was for this ball to be happening. And of course she went, because everybody felt they had to go. The ball that we know, so here's some more of the writers and painters ball of the 15th and 16th centuries. The upper left is the beautiful model, Maxime de la Falaise, Standing next to her, completely disguised, is Christian Dior. On the far right is the Baroness de Rothschild. Once upon a time, as I said, Marie-Laure doing the Fond de la Mer. Here she is in a dress intended to represent any number of flounders, sort of all sewn together. This is sort of at the time that great room of hers at the house, the Jean-Michel Franck room, was sort of open for the first time to the public, was as a costume ball. The ball that we know the most about, largely because, thank God for society columns, and columnists desperate to keep all of us entertained, is the 1934 Materials Ball, which was written about widely in the newspapers, as well as the magazine Femina. Here we see Marie-Laure and Charles de Noailles dressed in what seems to be like waxed cotton. The idea was when you received the costume, you were told to wear nothing that was normal. It had to be waxed fabrics, basket work, vegetables, feathers, leather, paper, or cardboard. Femina said that anything, a usual mode of dress was prohibited. So here we have what many of the guests came up with. I love the Marquise de Montcalm I think it's the Marquise de Montcalm, at the far right, looking like a walking haystack, or at least a field of wheat. At the top, we have Fulco de Verdura, the jeweler, with the Princesse des Faucines et des Anges. Another guest in the lower left, who came all in fur, and I cannot figure out what the guest in the middle is supposed to be wearing, unless it's simply canvas, which is possible, but as a hunting costume. But the reason we know so much about this ball is because it spilled over into the garden. It was not simply in the house. The entire triangular garden was temporarily roofed for the evening, and the summer dining room was transformed into a stage for various productions, so that as people were coming in and out, you could watch, you could sit. There were events going on in the house, there were events going on outside the house. These were lantern slides that were projected either in the house or in the garden, it's unclear, that were done by the artist Jean Hugo. Here we get some of the more costumes. I'm sorry, I seem to have repeated myself, but here's the lady with the feathers. The Etienne de Beaumont, who gave his own amazing balls, is on the right, wearing, I presume, tinsel. Must be his material. Here he is at the ball. He did something called a divertissement gothique. I'm not entirely sure what that was, because the descriptions do not explain, but it does appear to be theatrical. There does appear to be a bit of vamping, and lots of sort of swaying about, almost as if you're in a fashion show. There was also a performance by the Rocky Twins, who were a famous pair of very beautiful Norwegian brothers, who were then wowing Paris at the Folies Bergères, performing with Mistonguette. They not only dressed as men, but they also did a nice line in performances as the Dolly sisters, a famous pair of sisters who were just sort of famous for wearing feathers and that sort of thing on stage. And then toward the end of the evening were the Blackbirds, the American group of African-American performers who were then also, like the Rocky Twins, wowing all of Paris, this time at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. So at the same time, or soon thereafter, at the Noailles, with their garden, they are also working on a country house, or what shall I say, a house by the sea in Hyères. Initially, what happened was that Charles de Noailles was given 4 acres of land by his mother as a wedding gift. And the Noailles wanted to build a very modern house. So here you have a poster of Hyères, which was a wonderful place to get away, 15-hour car drive from Paris. On the right is the house of Edith Wharton, who took a house there as well in around 1919. That was her winter getaway. The Noailles were searching for an architect who would have the same modernist sensibility as themselves. And what they found was that Le Corbusier was either too busy or didn't understand what they wanted. Another architect didn't seem to pay that much attention to what they wanted, I suppose, thinking that they were a little bit facile in their pursuit of modernity. What they settled on was Robert Mallet-Stevens, shown here, who was then also one of the flavors of the month for his incredibly modernist, very daring interiors and his buildings. Here on the left, we can see the house that he designed for the couturier Paul Poiret, which was not finished. Poor Mr. Poiret ran out of money, and it was finished for another client. But also on the right, you see the sets for Marcel L'Herbier's movie L'Inhumain, which the Noailles would have known, would have seen. I know that Charles de Noailles was very impressed by these sets. So here is the house that after a couple of tries, that Mallet-Stevens came up for them. Actually, it's really only the center portion of the house that was initially constructed, because Charles de Noailles said that he wanted to have a house that was as simple and as utilitarian as possible. Obviously, that didn't happen. It exploded into 40 bedrooms. Over time, up the hill, down the hill, with where you can see up here this is where the pool is, above the house. The entrance of the house is over here on the left. You would come up this and go into this entrance court. So here you can see the house, which has actually been beautifully restored at this time and is used as a cultural center in Hyères. So you can see how the house and the landscape are all interwoven, excepting what's outside of it that has nothing to do with their property. But so it's enclosing gardens, it's enclosing outdoor rooms. Here's the entrance of the house on the left, which you reach by coming up this drive. This is the end of that. You come up the drive and then drive into this entrance court and then through that gate. Here are some of the interiors that Mallet-Stevens came up with, using furniture by some of the most famous designers of the day. On the upper left is Charles de Noailles' Salon Rose, which was his pink study. Below that is an outdoor bedroom with sliding glass walls. And then this is the piscine up on the upper level of the house. And the modernist aspect went as far as the nursery for the children. The Noailles had two daughters, Laure and Natalie. And I love that they felt that modern art by fine artists needed to be displayed above the crib, which this is a wonderful piece by Eastern European artist Druski. What I love about this painting is that it parallels in some fashion the garden that is the most famous, one of the gardens at the Noailles house, the one that has died, that has been reborn, that has died again, that has fallen apart, that has been restored, reinterpreted, but it's still there in a skeletal fashion. So they wanted to reach out again to another talent. Presumably the Veras were tired, they were bored, they had other people to deal with. So they went to a young architect named Gabriel Gouvrekian, who was an Armenian talent who worked for Robert Mallet-Stevens' office. Here you see the entrance court of the house with its orange trees. This is not a Gouvrekian moment, but I jumped ahead of myself a little bit, because what I love about this space is the picture windows that have been cut into the walls that enclose all of this, so that, again, you have sort of naturalistic paintings that you see after you've seen all of the modernist paintings in the house. I also find it incredibly fascinating that with two children, none of these openings had bars or anything. They must have kept them all on leads. But I think this is just, it's an astonishingly amazing outdoor room. Again, not so much a garden as just sort of an enclosed terrace. And here you see the pool looking down into the enclosed terrace, and well as seeing the Mediterranean beyond. And here again, we have the windows with the bay trees clipped into absolute perfection. Now, and we're looking for a modernist garden, you have to sort of keep in mind what's being shown around Paris or France or the world at the time. So this is Robert Mallet-Stevens' Garden of the Concrete Trees, which was at one of the Exposition Decorative 1925. Very odd, very wonderful. I often look at this and wonder what that enclosed terrace would have been like if it had fake orange trees and sort of cement sculptures. But instead they turned to Gabriel Gouvrekian. As I mentioned, he was working for Robert Mallet-Stevens. He became very famous in 1925 for the Garden of Light and Water that he designed for the Exposition. And here you see, it's not really a garden. It's a painting, or it's a sculpture, or maybe it's both, or maybe it's none. It's an interesting exploration of Gouvrekian's fascination with Persian gardens, and also his interest in modernity, in the most cutting edge possibilities of sculpture and gardens. He was commissioned to design this. I love that the center sphere, mirrored sphere, rotated all day long and into the night, sort of sending off sparks of sunlight. At night, there were lights trained on it, colored lights. So there was another sort of disco effect going on. Everyone was rather astonished by it. This is his rendering of it. Charles de Noailles fell in love with it. Just thought it was exactly what he needed for the house at Hyères, because there was a triangular section at the end of the house off of the lower salon below that enclosed terrace. And this is what Gouvrekian came up with. Again, an exploration of what he had just done on the Garden of Water and Light. Here, it was raked like a stage. So the upper section was higher than the low. There were to be metal spheres at the bottom that would reflect all of the colors. There were mauve tiled squares, rather like that checkerboard painting in the children's nursery, that were interspersed with plantings. Again, just like in Paris, to be kept low and to be seasonally pulled out. Because again, it wasn't so much a garden to be enjoyed, although there were walkways, as you can see on either side, that sort of stepped up to the far end, where you could look out through another sort of port to look out at the Mediterranean. And also on the sides, where is this tumble of triangular beds that could be either paved with mosaics or planted with, again, seasonal flowers. So here you have the plan of the garden, which changed by the time it was actually installed. Instead of the 4 spheres at the bottom, there were 2 Chinese miniature orange trees that sprouted from squares of black glass set into the ground. Again, they were all, the plants went ahead. There were flower beds. The zigzagging triangles were flower beds. Here you see how on the right, how the driveway comes here, and then there's a walk that you can take up the stairs to the upper terrace. At some point during the planning of this garden, it was supposed to be completely enclosed, so you could not see it from anywhere. But the Noailles had these areas cut out. So it was not a surprise, but it was a hint of what was to come. Here you see the drive on the lower section, and then the walkway that goes past this sort of crumbled wall. And here, at the end of this garden, on the elevated section, the prow, as it were, is a Jacques Lipchitz statue called Joie de Vivre. You can see it here again at the far end, and here you can see on the right, the garden taken from the opposite direction, so you can see how you could stand in the upper garden and look down onto what is basically a flat painting. With, again, tulips, as we see in both images. And then there's a spring at the center. There was a natural spring on the property that fed this particular pool. So the idea was silence, color, and the bubbling of water. And that was really all that was the garden was to be about. And again, not to be experienced firsthand. You weren't going to go out and pick flowers. You might go out and look at the Lipchitz if you were so inclined, but you didn't have to, because like the rotating sphere at the Jardin, the Garden of Water and Light, the Lipchitz was set on a mechanical platform and turned slowly all day and all night, again with lights trained on it. Here's the picture of the Noailles with the Lipchitz. I love this portrait of them. He looks so quizzical. And here you can see, again, the Lipchitz, which is now at a museum in Germany. And you can see that the garden did not survive in its original time, in its original way. By the 1930s, Marie-Laure completely obliterated the design, or at least planted over it, and planted aloes instead, and she called it my salad. This garden, as well as the whole property of the Noailles here in Hyères, was meant for friends, cohorts, artists, musicians, dancers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here you see Charles de Noailles with Georges Auric, and his name escapes me for a moment. It's too bad. Oh, Buñuel, the cinematographer whom they supported and whose films managed to get Charles nearly excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But his mother took a trip to Rome and had a meeting with the Pope, and that was called off. It's good to have friends in high places. Costume balls also went on at the house in Hyères. Here's sort of seemingly a retread of La Femme de la Mer, or at least with Marie-Laure dressed in fishing nets and wearing what appears to be a colander on her head. And then the other guests you see here, Etienne de Beaumont came down from Paris. He looks like he's dressed as a swami, which has nothing to do with the sea. Here's somebody else who seems to have pulled a fishing net into life, and Marie-Laure carrying around this swordfish. Is it a swordfish? You know, a toothed beak of a fish around, and it's still there, oddly enough, at the house. Again, as I said, films were made. These are stills from a magnificent film, very short, surreal. Everyone thought it was sort of ridiculous. Everyone outside of their circle thought it was ridiculous. But it's called Bijoux et Biceps. And there's no better title than that. Someone needs to open a restaurant called Bijoux et Biceps. It's quite amusing, or a bar would be good. And it really was a film that Man Ray took. He was always in their orbit, but it's of the Noailles, their friends, all dressed in maillot, doing acrobatics, doing this, doing that, just sort of having a gay old time. Gay old time, we might want to stop for a moment because one of the gentlemen in the film turns out to have been their gymnastics instructor, Monsieur Sauret. I've not been able to find his first name, but I've always been interested in finding it out. He seems to have been well known at the time. This seems to have been very close to the year that Marie-Laure walked into her husband's bedroom and found Monsieur Sauret and the Vicomte together. Marie-Laure said that was also the year that she found her voice as a person. And she said, and once I found my voice, I never shut up. She took an incredible rash of lovers, very openly. Charles's were much more discreet. As we know, the transvestite performer, Barbette, who seems to have come into Charles's amorous orbit, did point out that he was the last gentleman on earth. So he was never going to say anything, and nobody else was either. But I love Bijou et Biceps, and you can see it online if you go to YouTube. It's most amusing. Also amusing, and also on YouTube, and I wish I could have figured out how to download a link or a GIF of some sort, was a movie called The Mysteries of the Chateau of Dice. And again, a surreal production that had absolutely no plot whatsoever, 26 minutes of just surreality, but filmed on the property in the various gardens. A mysterious couple, so mysterious as are all the characters, their faces completely shrouded in what appear to be ladies' stockings. So you never see their faces. They drive to the house, they drive up the drive, they come into the house, they find a mysterious pair of dice on the ground in the garden. They kick them around like soccer balls. Then they go into the house where they see acrobats with these hidden faces and people studying more dice and rolling them around. It's not Dolly, I mean, it's not important, but it is incredibly funny to watch because you just sort of realize just how absurd it all is. They obviously have lots of time on their hands. And I guess the balls became polling after a while. You have to do something else. But I also love the fact that as we were talking about earlier, gardens evolve, gardens change. Here we can already see that at some point the bay trees are being clipped into topiary. Here is the triangular garden as it has been over the last couple of decades, unrestored or on its way to being restored, again with the plantings. The trouble with the plantings, with the original plantings, were that it just became incredibly tiresome to replace the plants all the time. The heat of Hyères meant that these shallow compartments were constantly baked, so no plant really wanted to survive. And so the whole point of this alternating color and green, color and green, color and color and color was impossible to maintain, which accounts for all the aloes being planted at one point, and then it just being allowed to fall into disrepair because it just wasn't that crucial anymore to the lives of the Noailles or their marriage. They stayed very close friends. They lived together part of the time. They wrote each other or called each other every day. Charles became so enamored of gardening after these youthful explorations that Marie-Laure had the good taste to say, when a rather abrupt guest, I find very abrupt, someone would even say this to someone's face, does Charles prefer men or women? And Marie-Laure looked at them and said, he prefers flowers, which I do think was very classic and very genteel of her. Here is another picture of the triangular garden as it was a few years ago. And here are some additional views of the garden at various times. Again, I think these planters are quite magnificent. These stepped planters that all of the bay trees were held in. And then here we go, talking again about gardens and their changes. There have been no later photographs of the garden in Paris, that wonderful Vera shattered landscape. But Dora Maar, the artist and former Picasso muse, was a great friend of Marie-Laure's, and she was a patron of Dora's. You can see a little bit in these photographs from the 1930s, reflected in the mirrors that still were surviving, that things have become regularized. There are potted trees. Presumably the colored gravel has gone its way. Presumably the flat beds may have gone, I'm not sure. But now it's becoming a vertical garden. It's becoming more of what we think of as the garden that her grandparents might have had, her parents might possibly have had. Charles went on to having a wonderful life as an amateur gardener. Amateur in the sense that he didn't really have clients, but he designed the most ravishing gardens for himself at Fontainebleau, at Grasse, in other locations. And I find it magnificent that although he was considered so avant-garde in his early 30s, late 20s, that he's being celebrated here in his mid 70s as being this incredible talent in Vogue magazine. He was very famous for having taken the Queen Mother on a tour of gardens in Provence, one of which was his. It was like apparently the high point of his life. And even though he sort of gave up to a degree the modernist background that was in his life, he still collected modernist sculpture and put it into these traditional gardens at Grasse. Here you see a very large Lipschitz that he had commissioned in the 1920s. And I wanted to just show you a couple of pictures of that garden at Grasse, which is the Villa Noailles. If you haven't been there, you should. It's periodically open to the public. It is an unbelievably magnificent and inventive garden. Not the place you would stage a ball, or not the place that you would produce an offensive film. But it is a place for wandering. And I think that's what most of us want in a garden, is a place to wander, a place to look, a place to sit down and think. Hier went on as well. Here you see the orange trees in the front, you see Marie-Laure. The garden became sort of full of vines and other little things. It became enriched. She got rid of sort of the modernity, the famous modernity, by adding more and more things, as the Baron de Redé said about putting a teddy bear next to a piece of Augsburg silver or a postcard next to a Goya. She decorated Robert Murray Stevens' house with all sorts of flotsam and jetsam, some fabulous and priceless, some in the teddy bear variety. At this later in life, she had a donkey that she had wicker wings made and a basket, so oranges could be gathered, and the donkey could come to the house. I like this picture not only because I love this donkey, and I want to know who made the wicker wings, but the fact that she's had all the interior walls covered in vines. So it's now no longer concrete. It's a living hedge in the way that Charles has at Grasse with his actual hedges. Here you see the house now as it's been restored, beautifully, beautifully restored and used, as I said, as a cultural center. Here are the garden as it exists now. Unfortunately, without the Lipschitz, it's no longer there. So it sort of lacks sort of a purpose. I wish they put something there, but they do a great deal of art programs and things. So I'm sure that that pedestal comes into use periodically. Here, of course, is what the Paris garden looks like now. This was the Vera's shattered landscape. It's now the outdoor dining for the Cristal restaurant by Baccarat. Baccarat owns the house now. They purchased it some years ago, and it's now their museum. It's redone by Philippe Starck. But I look at this garden, which is not a garden, it's a lawn. But I look at this garden, which was so previously enclosed by mirrors and then having this wonderful tapestry of gravel and glittering things all over the ground. I look at this and I laugh because one of my favorite descriptions of this garden by the 1950s, it seems to have become basically a tapis vert. But it's Ned Rorem being awakened at about 2 in the morning, 1955, I believe. And he cannot sleep because there is all of this raucous, childish laughter coming from the garden. And he opens the window and he says in his diaries, I showed you earlier the portrait of Marie-Laure at one of her balls, standing with her lover, Oscar Dominguez, the Canary Island painter, who was this sort of monster of a man. He was like not the Hunchback of Notre Dame, but there was something monster-like about him. His height, his width, his face, everything was very exaggerated as a being. And they had a very tempestuous relationship, Marie-Laure and Oscar, that ended in his suicide. He also painted copies of her paintings and sold the real ones off. And it was discovered sometime during his lifetime that he'd been doing this. And she was taken aside and she was told that Picasso, it's not the real Picasso. It's not the one that's been hanging here for 45 years. And she had all of this scandal explained to her, and she said, "You just won't tell him." I mean, which I again thought was very elegant, that she would just let him feel that what he had, because he was a largely failed painter. He wasn't terrible, but she felt that if you saw his copies as the real thing, that it affirmed his talent, which he was not getting from his own paintings and his own art exhibitions. But to go back for a moment to Ned Rorem opening this bedroom window, he hears the laughing of Marie-Laure and Oscar. And he says, cavorting on the lawn, laughing, middle-aged, plump, and stark naked. They're chasing each other around the garden, playing, and Marie-Laure is heard to say, "We're the most beautiful kids, don't you think?" Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This sounds like so much fun.
Don't they sound like
Can we go back in time? Can we go there? Can we do this now?
I would not have wanted to have been her friend. There's a wonderful quote that she gives. Oh, she was apparently famous for saying all the wrong things at the wrong time. And that was, she heard that a friend had cancer and she called her up on the phone and said, "So I heard you're dying." I mean, she was, as she said, she never shut up.
But listen, we have a garden awaiting us, but I would like to take the time to do just a couple of questions, if that's okay. I know it will make us run a little late, but there was no way we could stop this. It was too entertaining. We had too much of a good time. So if there's a few questions, I'll take 1 or 2 questions. If there's some pressing question from the room about this lifestyle that is, I just keep thinking, does it still exist? Do people still do this? Are they contemporary, like wealthy people such as I don't know, the Bill Gates Foundation,
No,
Bill and
think
Melinda
of-
Gates,
think
they
of
don't
the
sound to
breadth.
me like they do this or talk like this or.
What I find is so fascinating is the breadth of their investment in the art of their time, and not just the plastic arts, the dancing, music. You know, she wrote poems that Poulenc set to music, and then gave concerts. I mean, they are so multifaceted as a couple that there's not an aspect of their lives that doesn't fascinate me, because they seem to have lived a life that was meant entirely as a work of art in itself, every aspect of it.
Well, that is definitely what we call l'art de vivre.
Exactly.
You know, when you put art in every aspect. We have one quick question on the chat. Can you just have a quick look, because we like to include our people locally. Were they friends with Vita Saxville West?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay, and the last time that was David
Vita
Hayes.
Sackville West, I'm sorry?
Oh, okay. There was a nice comment for David. We'll share that with you, because David Hayes is at the School of Landscape Architecture at Urbana-Champaign, and he said he was at the Baccarat Hotel, and that there's an element that's still there. He says, now owned by Baccarat, the pegs for supporting the mirrors were still on that one flank of
Oh,
fence.
excellent. So we have hardware left.
Yeah. Well, so on this, I will thank everybody that's with us online. We don't see them, but we know they're here, and we really appreciate they're here with us to share the talk. I want to thank everybody who's here today. Of course, I want to thank Mitch, because tout simplement,
Thank you.
you're the best. Tout
Merci
simplement.
bien, merci bien.
Well, I just want to say, people who are staying with us, just exit left. People who are moving on with the day, thank you for being with us. This is the last of our symposium for now. I believe that the symposium will return to its original schedule, which means we'll have another one in the spring. Aren't we lucky? And I will say that for those of you who love gardens, because this series is all about la vie dans le jardin, and for those of you who appreciated the Grand Chateau series with Russell Kelly, Russell comes back in January online from January 6th to present about the making of the French garden. He will put the same attention to details he did for the Chateau, but now he really wants to go back to the original Renaissance garden and all the way to modern gardens. So we stay with the garden at the time of year where there's only snow. In Chicago.
We need that. We need green. in
Mitchell,
Chicago.
thank you again. Merci
Thank
à
you.
tous et à bientôt.
Thank you very much.